The warning nobody took seriously until it was too late. It arrived quietly, without urgency, without drama, without headlines. A warning so subtle, it blended into the background noise of daily operations. And by the time anyone realized what it meant, the cost of ignoring it had already been locked in. To understand why this story matters today, we have to go back to a moment when everything appeared stable. The company was profitable, respected, and widely considered a safe bet. Internal dashboards glowed green. Forecasts reinforced confidence. Leadership meetings focused not on survival, but on optimization. The assumption was simple. When things are working, the smartest move is to avoid unnecessary disruption. That assumption would prove fatal. The warning didn't come from a crisis. It came from a pattern. A slow, barely perceptible shift in behavior that didn't trigger alarms because it didn't look like a threat. A small group of customers began using the product differently than expected, not abandoning it, not complaining, just bending it to fit needs the company hadn't planned for. At first, it seemed harmless, even flattering. Users were adapting creatively. Engagement was still strong. Revenue stayed steady. But hidden inside that adaptation was a signal. One analyst noticed it during a routine review, a subtle divergence between how the product was designed to be used and how it actually was. The gap wasn't large enough to impact quarterly numbers. It didn't show up in executive summaries, but it was consistent, persistent, growing. The analyst flagged it in a report that blended into dozens of others, noting that customers appear to be compensating for a missing capability rather than demanding it outright. The report received polite acknowledgement, nothing more. From leadership's perspective, there was no fire to put out, no churn spike, no competitive threat. And in organizations built on efficiency, signals that don't demand immediate action are often treated as noise. The analyst moved on. The pattern remained. What no one understood at the time was that this was the warning. Not loud, not urgent, but precise. A preview of a future the company was about to enter unprepared. And once that future arrived, it would arrive all at once. The pattern continued to grow, quietly and persistently. More customers began adopting the same workaround, shaping their own solutions where the product fell short. Support tickets mentioned it in passing, often framed as suggestions rather than complaints. Usage data reflected it indirectly. Features used in unexpected sequences. Workflows stretched beyond their intended purpose. Each signal alone seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a clear message no one was yet prepared to hear. Inside the company, the warning competed with success. Quarterly reviews celebrated efficiency gains. Marketing campaigns emphasized stability. Leadership praised consistency as proof of maturity. In that environment, a subtle behavioral shift felt like an academic curiosity, not a strategic threat. The product was still selling. Customers were still paying. The system appeared healthy. The analyst revisited the data months later, uneasy about how little had changed. The workaround had become normalized. New customers adopted it faster than longtime users, suggesting expectations were already misaligned at the point of entry. This time, the analyst escalated concern, framing it not as a usability quirk, but as evidence of unmet demand. The response was calm, measured, and dismissive. Leadership noted the idea for future consideration and returned focus to initiatives with clearer returns. What leadership didn't realize was that customers were no longer waiting. Instead of asking the company to evolve, they were adapting around it. And adaptation is often the final stage before departure. Meanwhile, competitors began noticing the same shift. Smaller players experimented with features that directly addressed the workaround customers had created themselves. These offerings weren't perfect, but they spoke the language users had already adopted. Early adopters noticed. Forums buzzed quietly. Comparisons appeared in places executives never looked. Still, inside the company, confidence held. Churn remained low. Contracts renewed. The warning stayed buried beneath metrics designed to measure stability, not relevance. The organization had become excellent at tracking performance, while losing sight of meaning. The analyst documented one final observation before moving on to another project. Customers weren't just compensating for a missing feature. They were redefining what the product represented to them. It was no longer the solution. It was the obstacle they learned to work around. That distinction mattered, because when customers stop asking for change, it doesn't mean they are satisfied. It means they have already started imagining something else. The shift crossed an invisible threshold the day a major client quietly changed his workflow. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no renegotiation. They simply stopped relying on the product for its intended purpose and integrated a third-party tool to fill the gap customers had been compensating for all along. From the company's perspective, nothing appeared wrong. The contract remained active. Revenue continued to flow. But the product had lost its position at the center of the customer's world. That change repeated elsewhere. Sales teams began hearing a new phrase during renewal calls. It still works for us. Not praise, not loyalty, just adequacy. And adequacy in competitive markets is often the last stage before replacement. Yet those signals rarely reach leadership. They were filtered through summaries designed to reassure, not alarm. Inside product meetings, roadmaps remained unchanged. Resources flowed toward polishing existing features, optimizing performance, and reducing costs. The assumption guiding every decision was consistency. The company believed customers valued reliability above evolution. What it failed to see was that reliability without relevance slowly erodes trust. Meanwhile, competitors accelerated. What started as small, niche offerings matured quickly. Their products didn't just address the workaround, they embraced it. They built directly around behavior customers had already adopted, validating what the original company had dismissed as marginal. Each release made the alternative feel less experimental and more inevitable. The analyst, now watching from a distance, recognized a pattern with growing unease. This wasn't disruption by force. It was replacement by alignment. Customers weren't defecting in waves. They were shifting quietly, one decision at a time, toward solutions that felt like they understood them. Then came the moment leadership could no longer ignore. A flagship customer declined to renew, politely, professionally, without complaint. When asked why, their answer was disarmingly simple. Your product hasn't kept up with how we work anymore. No anger, no list of demands, just a statement of fact. The loss triggered an emergency review. Executives combed through metrics, searching for a cause that fit familiar explanations. Pricing pressure, sales execution, economic conditions. But none of it explained what had happened. The numbers showed stability right up until the moment they didn't. That was when the old report resurfaced. The analyst's original warning, buried months earlier, reappeared in an archive. Read now with the benefit of hindsight. It was painfully clear. Every signal had been there. Every step had been documented. The future hadn't arrived suddenly. It had been announcing itself quietly for a long time, and the company had mistaken silence for safety. The realization hit with a force no emergency could match. There had been no dramatic collapse, no warning sirens, no sudden crisis. Just a slow erosion that unfolded while everyone was busy celebrating stability. The company hadn't failed to react. It had failed to listen. In the days that followed the lost renewal, leadership replayed decisions that once felt prudent. Delayed investments, deferred experiments, dismissed signals. Each choice made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern of avoidance disguised as discipline. The warning hadn't been ignored because it was unclear. It had been ignored because it was inconvenient. The climax wasn't a market crash or a hostile takeover. It was something quieter and far more unsettling. The realization that customers had moved on emotionally long before they moved on contractually. Trust hadn't broken. It had thinned. And once it thinned enough, no last-minute feature or discount could restore it. The company attempted to respond. New initiatives were launched. Roadmaps were rewritten. But now they were reacting to a future that had already formed elsewhere. Competitors weren't faster because they were smarter. They were faster because they had listened sooner. They had recognized a signal before it became a verdict. In hindsight, the warning was never meant to cause panic. It was meant to prompt curiosity. A question: a pause, a moment of humility. But organizations built on certainty often confuse calm with correctness. They assume that absence of noise means absence of risk, and that assumption carries a quiet cost. The resolution didn't come as a single fix. It came as a lesson etched into strategy documents, postmortems, and culture reviews. Signals don't always arrive screaming. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they repeat, and sometimes they wait patiently for someone willing to treat them as meaning instead of noise. Today, this pattern repeats across industries. Metrics remain strong. Dashboards stay green. Customers adapt instead of complain. And somewhere inside that adaptation, the future is forming again, quietly, patiently, without urgency. The question isn't whether warnings will appear. The question is whether anyone will recognize them in time. Subscribe to join the journey. The